If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. Ever since the Orange Man moved back into the White House, the cope on the left corner of the white media has been absolutely off the charts. There's been a lot of talking points that they've been trying to use to soothe their bruised egos, but I think that perhaps the most overused term that they've been saying is that Trump is somehow harming or alienating himself from his own base. These are people who have no idea what they're talking about. Now, the latest justification for this talking point comes from the recent air tragedy that happened in D.C. For those of you who have been living under a rock or just waking up from your coma, what occurred there last week is that as a passenger jet was coming in for a landing, a military Black Hawk helicopter was in the process of taking off, and apparently, I guess the Black Hawk just didn't see that this airliner was in its way, and from the video, it just crashed headlong into it. It just plowed straight into it. As a result, everybody on board the airliner and everybody on the Black Hawk, of course, were all killed. Now, as soon as this occurred, Donald Trump did exactly what he did in his first term. Instead of trying to be consoler-in-chief, instead he decided to be pipe bomb thrower-in-chief, and he said it was all because of DEI.
The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. Can you imagine?
Are you saying this crash was somehow caused and the result of diversity hiring? And what evidence have you seen to support these claims?
It just could have been. We have a high standard. We've had a much higher standard than anybody else. And there are things where you have to go by brain power, you have to go by psychological quality, and psychological quality is a very important element of it. These are various very powerful tests that we put to use, and they were terminated by Biden, and Biden went by a standard that's the exact opposite. So we don't know, but we do know that you had two planes at the same level. You had a helicopter and a plane. That shouldn't have happened.
Mr. President, you have today blamed the diversity elements, but then told us that you weren't sure that the controllers made any mistake. You then said perhaps the helicopter pilots were the ones who made the mistake.
It's all under investigation.
I understand that. That's why I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay?
A lot of people didn't know what exactly that meant because he didn't give any sort of details. He didn't say anything either about the airline pilots or about the pilots of the Black Hawk or about the air traffic controllers, though he was intimating that it might have been the air traffic controllers, but he didn't specify. But truth be told, when he said DEI, he actually didn't say anything about race or even gender, believe it or not. Not to say that he would have been bothered if he had, but the main thing he was talking about was mental health. That's what he kept saying, people with mental health issues and mental disease and all that. And of course, he also decided that he would throw in some profanity about Pete Buttigieg.
The FAA, which is overseen by Secretary Pete Buttigieg, a real winner. That guy's a real winner. Do you know how badly everything's run since he's run the Department of Transportation? He's a disaster. He was a disaster as a mayor. He ran his city into the ground, and he's a disaster now. He's just got a good line of the Department of Transportation, his government agency charged with regulating civil aviation. Well, he runs it, 45,000 people, and he's run it right into the ground with his diversity.
Now, for a lot of people who were watching, they were figuring to themselves that Trump was having some sort of meltdown or that he otherwise had come unhinged. No, he hadn't. Donald Trump was playing the same game that he had always been playing, which is give the media some sort of bright, shiny object. Because as long as everybody's busy talking about Donald Trump having a press conference from hell about this tragedy, nobody's going to be looking at what he and Elon Musk are doing in the government. It's the exact same playbook that Trump ran 8 years ago when he did the same things. He knows exactly how to play the media like a fiddle, and that's exactly what he's doing. But putting aside whatever palace intrigue is going on behind the scenes, let's talk about the media aspect about this. Is Donald Trump attacking his own base? By base, what they're talking about is white women, because the identity of the Black Hawk helicopter pilot has been made known. It was a white woman who was the pilot of it. Now, while the U.S. military has been sitting on her identity for the last few days, because that's their policy, they want to make sure that their service members' families know about any fatalities before the public does. But obviously, as Commander-in-Chief, the Orange Man already knew who the helicopter crew was immediately, the day of the tragedy. He also knew the pilot wasn't black, that in fact the entire crew was not black, nobody on board was. About the only person of color that seemed to be involved was the pilot of the airliner, and he was doing exactly what he was supposed to. He was Hispanic, by the way. But nonetheless, Donald Trump threw out his DEI pipe bombs, and he allowed for the media to do what they always do, which is to obsess about it, because Trump says something outrageous, and that gives them material for the news cycle. But by allowing all of this rampant speculation to take place, those people who might have already speculated that the pilot of the helicopter was probably a woman, a lot of them were sitting there saying, well, maybe it's a trans person or something. There was more than a little rumor mongering and gossiping about that, but it turns out that it wasn't a trans person after all, and this was the white right doing their usual one-track minded moron behavior. They simply didn't seem to believe that the Orange Man would deride or denigrate a biological white woman simply by virtue of being a woman. They figured that being white would count for something, but it didn't. And on a side note, by the way, only about 4% of pilots in the United States are black. This is because of the financial barrier that goes along with becoming a pilot. It costs about $200 an hour to get flight lessons, tens of thousands of dollars to get a private pilot's license, and easily $100,000 for a commercial pilot's license. And commercial aviation is racist as any other arena of the society because they engineered an artificial majority for a particular demographic. So it's not like they believe in a meritocracy. They don't. White supremacy is not and cannot be about merit. White supremacy is about establishing a system of goodies, giveaways, but most of all, guarantees for those who are classified as white. If they have to work for something, that's not a guarantee. And they don't want to work for, much less fight or kill for, a system that doesn't give them guaranteed outcomes. White supremacy made a social compact with its beneficiaries, that they would never be made to compete, that they would be given things, simply have it handed to them, merely by virtue of how they're racially classified. Now, I say all of that to say this. A number of white pilots, not all, but definitely enough, try to claim that their non-white, read black counterparts, because that's who they're talking about, aren't qualified, or otherwise aren't as good. You know, the usual lying talking points. I want you to think about the air traffic disasters that you can remember in the U.S. Not just the one from last week, but any of them. Who were the pilots on all of those flights that you can recall? All of them white males, except for this week. I can't think of one that had a black pilot involved. Not even one. Now, of course, when confronted with this simple and undeniable stat, you'll have these racist trash say, well, white pilots are the overwhelming majority in the U.S., so of course they would be the vast majority of pilots involved in air traffic disasters in the U.S. No, we're not going to accept that deflection. These white supremacists are constantly pulling out the old per capita talking point when it comes to the FBI's crime stats. So we're going to apply their same reasoning, if it can be called that, to this. Per capita, shouldn't we be seeing black pilots as a disproportionate number of airline crashes? Why, they're only 4% of airline pilots, but they're like 20% of airline crashes. Shouldn't that be the kind of stats that we see? If these white pilots are correct and the black pilots are totally and thoroughly unqualified, just a bunch of DEI hires, affirmative action hires, and they don't know how to fly planes, then shouldn't that at some point in the last 60 years have been reflected in the number of air traffic disasters? Instead, we see that black pilots fly with a perfect operational record. Those are the facts. Black pilots are 4% of commercial airline pilots and yet 0% of airline crashes. Meanwhile, the guys who claim to be the only ones who earned, well, fill in the blank. These are the guys who are crashing the planes and involved in every regular aviation incident. Perhaps that's why we see people who are constantly shrieking DEI all the time. The guilty dog barks first, and they hope that by getting us all arguing about the lies they tell about non-white personnel, that we won't be focusing on their own bad track record. But hey, as we all know, basic math has an anti-white bias, as does history, and economics, and science, and reality. Now, one of the things that I'm sure that everybody noticed about all the headlines regarding Captain Rebecca Lobach is that she was identified as basically the third soldier on board the helicopter. That's what practically all of the headlines said. Very few of them actually said that she was the pilot of the Black Hawk. It just simply said that she was the other pilot on board and tried to make it sound like she was just basically a passenger. They didn't say that she was the actual pilot. They were very careful to try to dance around that one. Didn't want to say that she was. And something else that I also noticed was very few of the white media reports pointed out that she had actually been an aide in the Biden administration. I'm willing to bet that that probably had more than a little to do with the orange man's petulance about her. As far as he was concerned, she served in the Biden White House. She worked with the enemy. She worked for Biden. That's all I gotta know. She was no good. If she worked for Biden, she couldn't have been any good. Yeah, Donald Trump. Something triggers him and he just stays triggered forever. But those headlines that basically didn't say that she was the actual pilot made it where basically they didn't mention that at all. Yeah, I'll bet that there was a lot of folks in the left corner of the white media who, as far as they're concerned, they're not going to say or do anything that gives any fuel to Donald Trump's fire. But I'm sitting here wondering, if this had been a black pilot, do you think they'd be doing that? Or do you think that they would be saying, well, there are serious questions about the admission standards and such? They'd be saying that he was the pilot all day long. If it was a black person, male or female, be saying that they were the pilot. That's what all the headlines would say. There would be absolutely no attempt whatsoever to try to skirt it or obscure it or dance around it for the sake of not giving Trump a propaganda win. All right, now back to the subject of this evening's address. Why did Trump decide to call this white biological female pilot a DEI admission anyway? Why did he choose to go there? Well, I think that there were probably two reasons aside from distracting people from the machinations of his buddy Elon Musk. First, when was the last time that there was an air traffic safety crisis in the United States? A major one. Well, the last time there was one of those was during the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. Remember those? Now, they didn't happen inside the United States, but it definitely affected the American airline industry in a major way. And who was president during that crisis? Donald Trump. And yeah, Trump was giving Pete Buttigieg some harsh words, but the truth of the matter is when Buttigieg was transportation secretary, there were no airline crashes. So that being the case, what do you think Trump's going to be doing? Of course, he's not going to be sitting there saying, well, the guy was a hair ahead of me. Well, these guys had crashes all the time, and you people in the media, you didn't care about that. Instead, he couldn't say that. So instead, what he was saying was, well, DEI hires. Look over there. Just care about all this crazy stuff that I'm saying. But there is no way in hell that he would forget that the last time that there was an air traffic safety crisis in this country was also during his administration. He could not help but remember that. So I think that's one of the things he was doing, trying to get out in front of this by giving the media something to misdirect them. But there's also another issue also related to his first term. The last time that we saw Donald Trump deciding that he was going to basically ignore, if not denigrate, the death of a white woman, it was the first year of his first term, when in 2017 his thugs who went to Charlottesville killed Heather Heyer, and he responded to that by calling them very good people. A lot of people were surprised and shocked by Trump's reaction, but the main thing they should have been shocked and surprised by was the reaction of white women to this, which was nowhere near as offended or vitriolic as the left corner of the white media might have hoped. And when you look at the reaction of white women in particular to Donald Trump's DEI dog whistling, you also see that they're not up in arms about this either, even though a white woman died in this case. More if you include the white women who were also on the passenger plane. White women voted for Donald Trump last year about 53%. In 2020, about the same number. And in 2016, about half of white women voters cast their ballots for a man who they knew had been caught on a recording bragging that he grabbed white women by their genitals. Trump not only gave lip service to the criminals who killed a white woman, Heather Heyer, but he also didn't have anything to say of sympathy for her. They ran her over with a car, and that didn't stop nearly the same number of white women for voting for Trump again in his re-election in 2020. It was only the resurgent black vote that threw the orange man out of the White House that year, because in 2024, even though Trump had been found civilly liable for sexually assaulting a white woman, a majority of white women in America still went into the voting booth and cast their ballots for him anyway. And why did they do that? For the same reason you don't see white women outraged that he just threw a young white woman under the bus to perpetuate his DEI talking points. White women understand that their position in this society is not based on their gender. It's based on their race. This is how you can get women who are Democrats like Amy Cooper in New York, who would lie through her teeth and make a false police report against a black man in her feckless attempt to weaponize her whiteness. She knew that being a woman wouldn't get the cops to show up. If she said she was a black woman and she was accusing a white man of something, nobody would show up. Or if they did, they would have her arrested. But she knew that by being white, That would get the police to give an automatic response to her call. In other words, that white woman Democrat did what every white conservative woman has done precisely because she was aware that she lives in a society where there's a system of guarantees for her based on her race. And that how the police, authorities, and white media would also react would be based on her race, not her gender. She wasn't relying on any female privilege. She was relying on her white privilege. And when you see how the crooked DA Cy Vance casually refused to prosecute her, you see that she was right. Now, the left corner of the white media and their sycophants can sit there with their fever dreams and their delusions about how Trump is losing the support of his own base. No, the reality is the orange man understands his people a lot better than the left corner of the white media would like to pretend. White power understands the need to get people in line by forcing them to toe the line. And it works. Most people are sheep. You go ahead and push them and they get in line. White power respects strength, not weakness. Even Bill Clinton said that. He said the nation would vote for strong and wrong before it voted for weak and right. This is why when black people were marching and praying and dancing in the streets, the cops were still attacking us full time. But when the uprisings began in 2020 and the police found themselves being held accountable by the citizens, then suddenly the cops bowed down. The DAs suddenly realized they could charge these murderers, and even without laws being changed, the police suddenly started getting charged and convicted. See, things changed when black people started getting realistic and realized that they were not going to be able to shame the enemy into civilized behavior. You're going to have to break the enemy's will. The operative term there being break. Not negotiate, not compromise, not touch their hearts with kindness, but break these white supremacists. So Trump's DEI reference was basically his attempt at playing three-dimensional chess, such as it was. This is how white power disciplines its ranks. And as I explained to you, the U.S. military had the best definition of discipline that I've ever seen. When you put the goals of the organization ahead of your own personal desires. The goal of white supremacy is permanent dominance. Now, this or that individual white person's desire may be for equality and friendly relations with those not classified as white, but when white power makes it clear that it's on the march and working to justify the use of violence for its power, you better make sure you get on board with that. White power's goal of maintaining its dominance and the tangible benefits it continues to confer as a result of it had better be what's important, not one's own personal desires. And white women who supported Trump, they know this. So for the folks who are sitting here trying to talk themselves up and say, well, Trump, he's doing it in his own base, and I guess they're hoping that those people on the white right and a number of those people who are white in the center, hopefully they're going to be looking at Trump and going, oh God, we want him out of there, please. The people who voted for Trump knew exactly what they were getting. Part of the reason why Trump's decided to go ahead and engage in Operation Adios, or whatever the hell they're calling these mass deportations. He knows that as long as he gets those headlines out there showing that he's marching into these blue cities and that he's rounding people up, that's going to confer a lot of psychic, if not necessarily financial benefits for those who just want to see a lot of the illegal aliens finally gotten out of the United States. As long as he's seen as doing something, and it's going to be big and it's going to be controversial, but as far as they're concerned, that's fine. If he's not able to straighten out the economy, can he straighten out some other things as well? That's going to be sufficient for a large number of people. And as for the left corner of the white media who's sitting here and kvetching and hand-wringing and desperately hoping that they can convince the public to turn against Trump, they were wrong 3 times in a row about him, and Trump's goal now is to make them pay for it. This is the reason that Trump's being so ruthless about what he's doing. You want to know why that is? You should put yourself in the orange man's shoes. When he left office 4 years ago, I guess what he thought was that he was going to go slither back to Mar-a-Lago and basically golf full time and hopefully make good with whatever financial connections his crooked son-in-law Jared Kushner had made with the Saudis. But the Democrats had other plans for the orange man. When he left office, they already had him teed up for an avalanche of criminal and civil suits. They began with the criminal lawsuits the moment that he left the Oval Office. They turned him into the first U.S. president in history to ever have to pose for a mugshot. That was a humiliation that he'll never forget. And then they turned him into a felon. And they successfully have him on the hook for millions of dollars in civil damages. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when all of their Trump is going to be the next Hitler if he's elected rhetoric resulted in someone trying to kill him, and literally missing him by a single inch. Trump is petty as a pancake, so you're an idiot if you think that he doesn't spend at least several minutes every day thinking intensely about how close he came to being killed. Due to the Democrats and the left wing of the white media, Trump is going to be the next Hitler talking points. They push that stuff full time. Everybody from Rachel Maddow to the White House, they were all saying the same thing. This guy's going to be an authoritarian. American democracy is about to die. This is the end. And then somebody showed up with a rifle and in front of the whole world opened fire on him and very nearly killed him. So no matter how much the Democrats or the left wing of the white media may talk about Donald Trump and his tone, his rhetoric is so harsh and incendiary, just keep in mind Donald Trump's looking and thinking, well, none of my supporters ever tried to shoot at the Democrats. Sure, they tried to overrun the Capitol building and tried to go ahead and kill the vice president among others, but none of them were taking pot shots at the president or anything. That's Trump's mental calculus. That's how he sees it. But on top of that, no matter what's going on, you better believe the entire reason that Donald Trump absolutely had to regain the White House is because this is the only hope he has not to be buried under a ton of lawsuits and pending criminal charges when he leaves. He knows that when he leaves office in 4 years, the Democrats are going to try to resume their lawfare campaign against him. So he's determined to go scorched earth and try to make sure that that doesn't happen. He is literally fighting for his survival. And like him or hate him, and I definitely don't fall in the like him crowd, you better understand that, because if you don't, then you'll be just like the left corner of the white media, frustrated and speechless as to what he's doing and why it's working. And equally clueless as to why his base keeps backing him up regardless of how much anti-Trump media there is, and why it is that there seems to be a rump contingent of people who are in the center or left of center who are actually susceptible to the orange man's message. There's a reality here, and it's one that the Democrats in the left corner of the white media simply don't want to face up to. But Trump understands exactly what he's doing, not just playing the white media like a fiddle, but also how it is that he can go ahead and step across these lines without politically imploding. White power has no existential crises that it's facing right now, nothing that's going to wipe it out, except for black empowerment potentially. But for the most part, nobody's really trying to wipe out white supremacy, certainly not the white right. They're not facing an existential crisis, though what they do have right now is a crisis of confidence. For as long as any of them can remember, they've had the idea of a white majority in the U.S., and that was the rhetorical justification for the racial imbalance in this country. But as the demographics have shifted, they've required a new justification for maintaining the old status quo, and we see them trying these increasingly ridiculous and hostile measures to basically legislate themselves to be in power forever. And a lot more white leftists and white people who are left of center actually agree with Trump than are willing to admit it. That happens to be a reality that Democrats simply don't want to see, but the orange man sees it. He's been validated, if only in his own mind, when he tells people, hey, there's a lot of folks out there who are the silent majority. That's Richard Nixon talk, by the way. They actually agree with me. They just don't have to say it out loud because they don't want any blowback from all of these people brainwashed by this media. Donald Trump is preaching an unvarnished sermon of white primacy. That's what the goal ultimately here is. We're going to have a resurgent white primacy in America. We're going to reestablish firmly the pecking order. Oh, we've had this 60-year-long footsie and flirting with the idea of being a meritocratic government and a meritocratic society. But you know what? This little experiment in merit needs to come to an end. We need to reestablish white is right. We need to make sure that it's guaranteed no more of even stepping a toe across the line into the land of justice. And you know what? Considering the fact that this is exactly the kind of thing that makes it where people can't deny the reality, that's going to actually be a net positive. There have been a lot of people who have been hoping that they could hit the doggone snooze button and go back to sleep. So let the orange man get out there from the very seat of government and let him go ahead and shriek DEI all day long. Let every white supremacist troll, scumbag, and MAGA maggot from sea to shining sea get their jollies with him sitting here and playing to their rhetoric. Let them all go ahead and do that. Because at the end of the day, the only way that this is going to change is if there's an actual substantive political opposition that truly steps forward and says, you know what, we haven't been fighting for any of these principles that were established back in the 1960s. We haven't actually been taking on the white right. Instead, we've been playing footsie with them. And it is way past time for that to change. But you're not going to get that kind of 180-degree turn from the Nancy Pelosi's or the nigga Jim Clyburns or the Jim Crow Joe Bidens or the cop Kamala Harris's or any of the rest of this gang of political prostitutes. What's going to have to happen is there's going to have to be some political pain that's going to have to be put on some people who are a little bit comfortable for too many years. All of these little trolls and shills who have been saying vote blue no matter who, they're going to have to come up with a better slogan than that. They're going to have to actually do what they've been avoiding doing for the last 30 plus years, and that is put an actual agenda on the table that's going to attract black voters. And more importantly than that, they're going to have to actually be serious about it. All of this lip service, that stuff is done. And I know that these guys have had a free ride politically off of black people's naivete and gullibility, but the gravy train has at long last derailed. And that being the case, if they want to see themselves getting back in power again, they're going to have to actually admit to the economic and political realities that they themselves helped to bring about. Remember, most of this garbage that the Republicans have been doing, most of this legislative performative extremism was only possible, A, because Democrats were not fighting them by and large, and B, in many cases, Democrats actually went along with it and voted for it. When you have people like Jim Crow Joe bragging that he's going to divert COVID funds so that he can give more money to the thugs in blue, how the hell is that any different than what you would expect from Ron DeSantis or from Donald Trump? The answer is, it's not. But of course, as we know all too well, there's no guarantee that these clowns and the Democrats are ever going to wake up from their coma and decide to start acting like they got some sense. The game for them right now is to see if they can wait us out, if they can hold out. That's the game they're playing. They're thinking to themselves that hopefully things are going to become so offensive. People will be so offended by the orange man's rhetoric that they'll go ahead and vote for us without requiring us to do anything. It's the same playbook that they ran after Trump got elected the first time. Now, I personally don't like any of the anti-DEI rhetoric because I recognize it for the anti-black dog whistle that the Republicans use it as. But the reality happens to be the Democrats have been sitting on their hands, allowing the Republicans to get away with all this garbage. Everything that they let the Chris Rufos do, attacking critical race theory and not doing anything legislatively or in any other way to fight back or push back or to punish the white right, they were the ones who made it where you could go ahead and do this mess as more or less a victimless crime. They did it deliberately to encourage it because they didn't want the black grassroots making our demands. Barack Obama was the one who started attacking woke before anyone on the white right did. People forget about that. But the black grassroots didn't. But if their political calculus is that all they have to do is just sit there with the steady drumbeat of orange man bad, orange man racist, and that eventually black folks are going to once again come to the rescue like we did 4 years ago, so long as they're coming up to us empty-handed, they're going to be in for a shock. So that being the case, go ahead and let the orange man squeal and screech against DEI. Let him go ahead and trample all over the graves of a white woman. Go ahead and let him do all of that mess all day long. Because for the longest time, Democrats were only too happy to be inactive in the face of Republican aggression against black people. So now it's way past time that some of these other groups got to see their own comfort crash and burn. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Miss Debbie, Stay Positive, Ronald Waits, Tyquin Campbell, and Gregory Franklin. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.